pleased to yield now to gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Clay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. You know, the Accountability Review Board made a number of recommendations to better strengthen overseas embassies and missions like the one in Benghazi. Mr. Nordstrom, you told our staff that you read the ARB's unclassified report and recommendations. Do you think that implementing these recommendations is important to ensure the safety and security of our foreign service?
Absolutely. I had an opportunity to review that along with the other two committee reports. I think taken all together, they're fairly comprehensive and reasonable.
And I guess a diplomat like you probably feels very disheartened when you read in the paper, say you're overseas, and Congress has cut this budget for embassy security, and Congress has been cheap, on the cheap, providing protection to our personnel. You know, in order to make security possible at our missions and our embassies throughout the world, it's one recommendation in this report that attempts to grapple with these issues and err on the side of increased attention to prioritization and the fuller support for people and facilities engaged in working in high-risk, high-threat areas. The solution requires a more serious and sustained commitment from Congress to support State Department needs, which in total constitute a small percentage both of the full national budget and that spent for national security. But it's exactly what we in Congress have failed to do in the past. Let's look at our record. House Republicans voted to cut the administration's request for embassy security funding by $128 million, and that was in fiscal year 2011. In fiscal year 2012, they cut the request by even more, providing $331 million less than requested. You know, our Republican counterparts have just said that these cuts are based on their priorities and choices. And when asked whether he voted to cut diplomatic security by over $300 million on CNN, Representative Chaffetz responded, absolutely. Look, we have to make priorities and choices in this country. But these cuts have impacts, serious impacts. And I want you to know that my priorities, including funding these recommendations, which will save lives. You know, the ARB, Mr. Nordstrom, just to be clear, you provided information to the ARB, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And Mr. Hicks, is it true that you also provided information?
The ARB interviewed,
ARB?
yes.
You know, it was led by Ambassador Pickering and Admiral Mullen, who happens to be the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In its investigation, the review board interviewed more than 100 people, reviewed thousands of pages of documents, and viewed hours of videotapes. The board made 29 recommendations to improve security systems and procedures to prevent future deadly attacks. And a key finding made by the board related to availability of funding, is specifically for temporary facilities in high-risk, high-threat environments. And the board stated, the department should develop minimum security standards for occupancy of temporary facilities in high-risk, high-threat environments and seek greater flexibility for the use of Bureau of Overseas Buildings Operations sources of funding so that they can be rapidly made available for security upgrades at such facilities. And it is important to note that the facility in Benghazi was designated as a temporary facility. Mr. Nordstrom, do you agree with the board's review?
That was actually one of the specific things that I talked with the board. My concern is there is no such thing when you look at the FAM or the OSPB standards for a temporary facility. And so by its very nature,
So they developed the recommendation.
after the fact.
How about you, Mr. Hicks? Do you agree with the recommendation?
I'm not a security expert. I'm a diplomat. I'm an economic officer. But I'm support every improvement that can possibly be made to improve our security overseas, including increasing the training of our personnel.
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. I would also thank the gentleman from Missouri, but ask, were you here on October 10th when the person who had those requests for additional security said money was not a factor, Charlene Lamb? Do you remember her?
I can't remember if I was at this.
Well, Mr. Nordstrom, you were on that panel. Do you remember what she said?
Yes, she said that resources was not an issue, and I think I would also point to the ARB report, if I'm not mistaken, that they talked to our chief financial officer with DS, who also said that resources were not an issue. So,
Mr. Chairman, the ARB says resources were an issue.
Well,
I guess the question that I have about the ARB, and again, it's not what the ARB has, is what it doesn't have, and that it stopped short of the very people that need to be asked those questions, and that's the Undersecretary of Management and above. Those are perfect questions that he needs to
And I'm
explain.
sure that if we implement some of the recommendations, it will help us prevent a future attack.
and I appreciate that. And what I would say is that in the earlier hearing in October 10th, the one thing we did discover is, yes, this facility was not able to take the blows even of a small bomb that had gone off earlier. Mr. Nordstrom testified to the fact that this consulate, temporary consulate, had been attacked twice, and they'd breached the wall. So there was an awful lot of recognition that it was an insufficient facility, and I think that's ARB, no ARB, that's something that's well in the committee's record, but I thank you for bringing it out.
Thank you.
We now go to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Micah.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, I have to again tell the families that we will continue to pursue this, and all the facts need to be known about what took place and hold people accountable. And then next to the witnesses, thank you for your service. Thank you for your bravery in actually coming forward. And again, some of the commendable acts of the State Department employees you described. As everybody may know, and I follow up really on my colleague, Mr. Clay's question about the report there, Accountability Review Board report, and this is the unclassified version. There's a classified version also. This is available online. And we have a responsibility under law to review these situations and to go to people who actually had firsthand knowledge. Now, Mr. Thompson, you have a very important position. The title is Bureau of Counterterrorism Leader, Foreign Emergency Support Team, U.S. Department of State, right?
Correct.
Okay, and did you participate? Were you interviewed by the ARB?
I was not.
You were not interviewed, okay. And you were on the job during this period?
I was at my desk that night till 2 o'clock in the morning.
And you were not allowed to convey information to the board?
On the 17th, I conveyed my request to be interviewed before the board.
And so they did interview you after that?
No,
Have you ever been interviewed?
I have not.
You have not. So you're one of the primary players, but yet the board failed to interview. Would you say that's correct?
That is a correct
Mr.
statement.
Thompson, is he an important player? I'm sorry, Mr. Hicks, is Mr. Thompson an important player in this, Mr. Nordstrom?
I would say yes,
Okay.
certainly in the aftermath of the attack.
Okay, let me go to Charge Hicks. Were you interviewed by the board?
I was interviewed by the board.
Were you able to convey all the information that you felt was necessary regarding this incident to the board?
The interview took about 2 hours, and it was, in my mind, incomplete. A few days later, I had a separate meeting briefly with the executive secretary,
So you did have a follow-up meeting and you
With-
expressed that.
with
you
the
weren't-
board's executive secretary to amplify on some issues that had been discussed at the meeting, at
Okay.
the initial interview.
And Mr. Nordstrom, did you participate?
I did, on 2 occasions. I also shared with them
Could you
a
share
luminous
how
amount
that
of.
process worked that we heard from Mr. Hicks?
Sure, is this similar?
Was it thorough?
I felt it was thorough and professional. As I said, the report, and as I've held, the report is fairly thorough and comprehensive. My issue is that they stopped short of interviewing people that I personally know were involved in key decisions that led to how those events unfolded.
Well,
Specifically, how those buildings were
Yeah.
staffed and constructed and in variance with existing standards.
So
Those
you
are
felt they
all
felt-
critical to the.
They fell short. Well, in the unclassified version, they said security in Benghazi was not recognized and implemented as a shared responsibility by the bureaus in Washington charged with supporting the post, resulting in stovepipe decisions on policy and security. Now, the next part is interesting. That being said, Embassy Tripoli did not demonstrate strong and sustained advocacy with Washington for increased security for Special Mission Benghazi. Would you both agree with that?
If I could speak to that, I would disagree that it was a collaborative process. I'm not sure exactly the term they used. On a number of occasions, I testified in October as well. I raised issues, others raised issues, the ambassador raised issues, the DCM raised issues, to the point where reports and decisions on both the Tripoli compound and the Benghazi compound were decided in Washington, and those decisions were not either cleared with us or shared with us. So that doesn't seem as a collaborative process.
I want to have time for Mr. Hicks to tell us about his, thank you, Mr. Nordstrom.
Yes, sir. I monitored the discussions that Eric has testified about from my Arabic language student status. When I arrived in Tripoli, I had the understanding that these decisions had been settled and that we were not to relitigate them in terms of the number of personnel security personnel at post. I began a process to attempt to relitigate them in mid-August, and we held an EAC meeting to discuss the matter, and we were unfortunately unable to return to that issue before 9/11 occurred.
Thank you. We now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank the witnesses for their courageous service and your willingness to come before the committee here today. I also want to offer my condolences again to Ambassador Stevens and his family, Tyrone Woods and his family, Glenn Doherty of Massachusetts and his family, and Sean Smith. These were American heroes, and they were our very best. I don't want that part to be overlooked. These individuals were regarded as our very best, including Ambassador Stevens, without question. I think his opinion and the respect that his experience and authority in matters, all matters in Lebanon, Libya, and not only in Tripoli but also in Benghazi was unquestioned, I think, and it showed in the deference that others gave him to those decisions. I thought the ARB report especially did single out some areas where I thought they were trying to identify where the decisions that were made may have been deficient, and they do identify at page 30. They talk about the Bureau of Diplomatic Security and NEA, the Near Eastern Affairs, and at Post, there appeared to be a very real confusion over who ultimately was responsible and empowered to make decisions based on policy and security considerations. They go on further to say the DS Bureau showed a lack of proactive senior leadership with respect to Benghazi, failing to ensure that the priority security needs of a high-risk, high-threat post were met. And at the same time, with attention in late 2011 shifting to a growing crisis in Egypt and Syria, the NEA Bureau's front office showed a lack of ownership of Benghazi's security issues and a tendency to rely totally on diplomatic security for the latter. The board also found that Embassy Tripoli leadership, saddled with their own staffing and security challenges, did not single out a special need for increased security for Benghazi. Now, what they point to in the next couple of paragraphs is they thought that the result, that the special mission Benghazi extension, that this was a temporary residential facility not officially notified to the host government, even though it was also a full-time office facility, resulted in the special mission compound being accepted from office facility standards and accountability under Secure Embassy Construction and Counterterrorism Act of 1999. Mr. Nordstrom, your point exactly. And the Overseas Security Policy Board, OSPB. So what they're saying is because there was an extension made, that there was a lowering in expectation there, that the resources for physical security and also the personnel assignments needed at that was not given an adequate priority, and that it was left to diplomatic security in some cases to make those repairs. Is that something that you see as being a weak point in this whole process that allowed Benghazi to be ill-prepared for the attacks on September 11th?
I do. As I said, I think that what still remains unseen is who made that decision to go ahead and assume that this is going to be a temporary facility. At one point, in fact, I was told by by colleagues in OBO and DS that the recommendations that we wanted to make, the upgrades, both in Tripoli and Benghazi, would not be made. They forwarded us the way forward documents that we discussed in October. And they said, and I quote, "It's my understanding that M, Undersecretary for Management, agreed to the current compounds being set up in occupied condition as is." The ARB in particular found it interesting at my reply, which was in February of 2013. I requested, "Is anything in writing? If so, I'd like a copy for post so we have it handy for the ARB." That's 8 months before the attack.
Right.
I got no confirmation as to who made those decisions, nor did I get a copy of that.
And so the status was still in limbo at that point? I know there was some discussions with Mr. Langford earlier, the gentleman from Oklahoma, that
My understanding was the facility, again, the types of facilities are whether or not you're sole occupancy of the building, or are you a partial occupancy of, say, a commercial building, or if you are in a building which is owned by the host nation. Well, clearly we were the sole occupant, and that's the standards. It's very clear, and it's based on our threat and those standards. We did not meet any of those standards with the exception of perhaps the height of the wall.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired.
I thank you. Just one thing, you used the term M for the Undersecretary for Management. Who was that?
At the time and throughout all of this was Patrick Kennedy, who was up here in October as well.
So that's who would have been the person who said no, or this is good enough, presumably.
Presumably, again, I don't know what the decisions, the factors were in his decision. I'm sure he had reasons for those decisions. I'm not going to criticize those. My only concern is that nobody has looked at those, whether it be the ARB or anybody else.
Thank you. Mr. Turner.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Gentlemen, I want to thank you for being here today. Without your statements, there is a tremendous amount of information that we just wouldn't know. And certainly it's important that you're giving us this information, as we all have deep condolences for the families. As we look at the information that we've gotten today, we basically have two stand-down decisions that we've been able to discuss. One, the Foreign Emergency Support Team that Mr. Thompson has told us about, and Mr. Hicks, you told us of Colonel Gibson. Mr. Hicks, I'm a member of the House Armed Services Committee, and I'm very fascinated with the stand-down order to Colonel Gibson. As we pursue that, we want to know who gave Colonel Gibson the order and why. And so I would like to review that stand-down order with you and what you experienced that night, since you were with him as he was receiving that stand-down order. You told us that there was a C-130 Libyan transport that had been provided, and that you had indicated to Colonel Gibson that he should go to reinforce Benghazi and help the withdrawal personnel. Colonel Gibson was told to stand down, and that plane left without him, landing about 7:30 in Benghazi without Colonel Gibson's team. So let's start first with the review of what is Colonel Gibson's team. What were those personnel, Colonel Gibson's team, what were they doing in Libya?
They are the remaining members of the special security team, this group of 16 or 14 special forces personnel assigned to protect Embassy Tripoli after the return and reestablishment of the embassy in September of 2011. And on the 1st of August, the Secretary of Defense signed an order changing their status from being a security team to a training team and transferring their authority from the Chief of Mission, the ambassador, to General Ham. On August 6th, 2 members of that team were in a carjacking incident as they were driving early in the morning outside the compound, and they had to use their weapons in order to escape that armed attack on their vehicle. In light of that incident, General Ham decided to draw down the team from 14 personnel to 4 personnel, and Lieutenant Colonel Wood and 9 others, Lieutenant Colonel Wood testified before this committee last October, left Tripoli in the middle of the month. So the Lieutenant Colonel Gibson and the other 3 members of that team are the remainder of that group.
So their chain of command had been changed and they had been reduced. But as you were just describing, these are highly trained individuals with specialized skills that would have been useful in the situation in Benghazi.
Yes, absolutely, and particularly given the fact, again, that the personnel in Benghazi were exhausted from a night of fighting against very capable opponents.
Now, do you know why they were told to stand down? Colonel Gibson give you any information or understanding of?
I actually don't know why.
Is there any reason to believe that the situation in Benghazi was over? I mean, there were a number of series of attacks that you've described to us. Any reason to believe that that there was no longer any danger in Benghazi?
No, it was every reason to continue to believe that our personnel were in danger.
Mr. Chase has given me an article that appeared in USA Today just this week, and just as early as last Monday, Major Robert Furman, a Pentagon spokesman, said that the military's account that was first issued weeks after the attack hasn't changed. There was never any kind of stand-down order to anybody. And that's a pretty broad statement, anybody. What's your reaction to the quote by Mr. Furman?
I can only, again, repeat that Lieutenant Colonel Gibson said he was not to proceed to board the airplane.
So your firsthand experience being on the site, standing next to Colonel Gibson, who was on his way on that C-130 transport, and being told not to go, contradicts what Mr. Furman is saying on behalf of the Pentagon.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Hicks, did the embassy have a defense attaché on staff whose role it was to interface with the Defense Department? And did you ask him at that evening, were there any resources coming from the U.S. Military? And what was your reaction to his responses as the evening unfolded?
My reaction was that, okay, we're on our own. We're going to have to try to pull this off with the resources that we have available.
Were the Libyans surprised?
I don't know, but I think they were.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Before we go to Mr. Connolly, just because most people in the audience, including on the dais, don't understand Chief of Mission authority, would you, as Chief of Mission, run us through who was under your Chief of Mission authority and who wasn't? In other words, who did you have command and control of? And we're talking about military assets, because I think a lot of folks up here are hearing 2 chains of command, and it'd be helpful for you to explain it as a career State Department person quickly.
All civilian civilian USG personnel in Libya were under Chief of Mission authority, which was
yours
until we knew that he was dead, and then that passed to me. The 4 members of the Special Forces team were under General Ham's authority. We had 2 other military Special Forces personnel in country, and I was at that time unclear as to whether they were under my authority or not.
So anyone you had under your authority, you gave orders to, they responded, they went down range if you asked them to. The others were not allowed to.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Connolly, thank you very much. You'll have your full time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for that clarification. By the way, there have been some statements that Undersecretary Kennedy was not interviewed by the ARB by Ambassador Pickering and Admiral Mullen. That is a misstatement fact. He most certainly was. You can look it up. It's documented. He was interviewed, and he provided evidence, and that evidence was evaluated. So it is simply not true that Undersecretary Kennedy was not part of that process. He most certainly was. And I'd ask, Mr. Chairman, the record so reflect.
Who said he wasn't? I'm not sure.
I think we've heard it from the table. Mr. Thompson, statements have been attributed to you that your bureau, the Counterterrorism Bureau, was actually deliberately kept out of post-Benghazi developments, decision-making, and so forth. Are those statements attributed to you accurate?
It's true that my portion of this office was not participant.
Your portion. To whom did you report?
I report to Dan Benjamin at the time.
And did Mr. Benjamin, was he included in
He was
conversation?
overseas at the time.
He was overseas, but was he kept informed and involved?
I kept him informed in the early stages of.
Was he kept informed and involved by the Secretary's office?
I have no idea.
Would it surprise you to learn that he has stated emphatically that he most certainly was?
It wouldn't be a surprise. I've read it.
And would it surprise you that he contradicts your statements or statements attributed to you? And I read to you, this charge that we were kept out of the loop in the aftermath is simply untrue. Though I was out of the country on official travel at the time of the attack, I was in frequent contact with the department. At no time did I feel the Bureau was in any way being left out of deliberations that it should have been part of, unquote.
I would disagree. He's true factually. He is, his view of how much of the
Okay,
CT
so-
Bureau was.
so for the
involved.
record-
If I may, sir, if he thinks he was adequately informed and given counsel on that, then that is his professional.
Well, he's the head of the Bureau, and he's, in fact, was your supervisor, and that's his testimony, so it contradicts yours.
I don't think it's his testimony, sir.
Well, I'm entering it into the record, so it's now in the evidentiary record, and
Would the gentleman
we could, no, I will, Mr.
I'll
Chairman.
hold the time.
Okay, certainly.
Mr. Cummings, perhaps you were here, perhaps not, has said among a lot of people that we want to bring before this committee, he is now an anticipated future witness, so he can give testimony.
The chairman anticipated exactly the point I was going to make, so we can clear that up by having Mr. Benjamin here. Thank you. Mr. Hicks, I don't think anyone who could have listened to your account, the minute-by-minute account of what happened, could be anything but moved. The trauma of what you and your colleagues must have gone through, especially being in Tripoli, not being able physically to sort of reach out and do something about Benghazi, I think all of us can relate to that. Terrible. I was in Libya and Tripoli in May of last year before the tragedy, and I don't remember whether we had a chance to meet or not, but David Dreyer led our CODEL. We were not allowed to stay in Libya overnight. What struck me when I arrived in Tripoli was that airport security was provided by a militia. And, you know, I've traveled a lot over my years in foreign policy, and, you know, what goes through the mind is what could go wrong with this? It's a volatile, violent, unstable, or was, situation. Do you want to talk just a little bit about the domestic situation in Libya as we found it? Because I think sometimes that gets forgotten in the retelling that we're facing instability in Libya still in a post-Gaddafi revolutionary situation, and likewise in Benghazi. Could you just share with us some insights into what you found in terms of that inherent instability?
Thank you, Mr. Connolly, and thank you for being my representative. First of all, I just want to say that I don't recall saying that anyone other than myself testified to the ARB or was a witness before the ARB. So I wanted to be clear about that. The second thing is the political and security climate in Libya at the time. It was highly unstable, although after the elections, we thought that the political trajectory, the elections in July, we thought the political trajectory was heading in the right direction. President Magariaf had been selected. They were trying to appoint a new prime minister and move towards a democratic government. The security scene, however, was very unstable and has been, I think, well documented. You had assassinations and car bombings in Benghazi, but the assessment was that this was Libyan on Libyan and not necessarily directed at foreigners. At the same time that we are in the process of building towards making our post in Benghazi a permanent post, the British are contemplating returning there to Benghazi. They left after their ambassador survived an assassination attempt in June. In Tripoli, we also have instability. We have car bombings, carjackings. We have Islamic extremist militias that begin to attack Sufi shrines, and a government that is struggling to maintain security and improve security in the country.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, if I could just say to my constituent, we're proud of you. And I would add my voice to that of Mr. Cummings. I'm a member of not only this committee, but the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And you have my personal pledge that were there ever to be any hint of retaliation or retribution, for your willingness to come forth and tell your version of what happened.
That is weird. When he asked that question, the television just blanked out. Kind of curious.
Democracy off the hook.
Yes, sir. I think that in our system of government, the decision-making authority is at the level of presidentially appointed, Senate-confirmed individuals. That's at the level of assistant secretary or higher. Now, the reporting coming out.
I think we just saw government censorship.
Conditions there, particularly the fact that we had to provide a daily report of who was in country to Undersecretary Kennedy, and the fact that he made the decision as to who came to Tripoli and Benghazi or who didn't, that budgets came to his table, and that security threat environment reports also came to his table, would suggest that there is some responsibility there.
Mr. Thompson, let me ask you this. Another thing I find surprising is that do the security people not consider the date of 9/11 to be? We've already heard somebody say that this mission was considered to be a high threat or a high risk mission. Do they not realize that 9/11 is a high security type date, and they should be prepared for terrorist activities on that date in particular?
Certainly. When I hear security, I think of Greg Nordstrom, so I won't go down the security trail too far here, but certainly on the anniversary of 9/11, since 9/11-2001, we have all had our antenna up, so to speak, and been forward-leaning, if not physically, mentally, on that particular day, yes.
The report basically puts primary blame for this situation on the Bureau of Diplomatic Security. I would like to ask if any of you have a comment about that. Do you think that's fair?
If I could,
Yes, Mr.
and maybe
Nordstrom.
this might also address Congressman Connolly's question. My concern with the report is not that Undersecretary Kennedy was or was not interviewed. I don't know who was interviewed. Again, that's part of the confidentiality of it. But there's been a lot of discussion of how many people were supposed to be there or not supposed to be there. Those things are not driven by regulations and law. That's a subjective opinion. Obviously, that was quite a bit of my testimony in October. I go back to who authorized embassy employees, U.S. government employees, to go into facilities that did not meet legal requirements. I don't know who made that decision. And the reason why is because, as Ambassador Pickering said, he has decided to fix responsibility on the assistant secretary level and below. How I see that is, that's fine.
Again, just as he was about to implicate the Secretary of State, my television mysteriously again shut off. Comcast. I'm going to now start just recording from the computer. It is not blacked out.